My full name is Marvin Arno Schilling. Well, I am 101 as of September 8th, so I'm a little bit beyond that now. Well, I was a minister of the at that time it was the Methodist Church. Now it's the United Methodist, because in 1968 the Methodist Church joined with the Evangelical and United Brethren Church, which was very, very much like the Methodist Church anyway. But as a result of that merger in 1968, they changed the name to the United Methodist Church. Of course, to go back even before that, in 1940, the Methodist Church North and the Methodist Church South, they were the same church that broke over the slavery question. North being against slavery, the South supported slavery. Well, they merged in 1940 after all these years of separation. I became a minister in 1940 of the Methodist Church, and then in 68 it became the United Methodist. I retired in 1978. Well, I have several memories of games we used to play. And since Hattie was closest to me in age, she was 2 years older. During the early years, she really was my playmate. But her choices for things to play were not necessarily mine, and my choices were not necessarily hers. I liked to play horse, but she had to be the horse, and I had to control the reins. But those were some of the memories that I had as a youngster growing up. You know, graduations, having achieved, are always favorite moments. But I suppose the most, I know the most favorite moment was when I had gone to Korea to teach in this high school, which was established by 5 denominations so that their youngsters in the Orient, English-speaking youngsters, could have a boarding school to go to. And the missionaries in the area always had a reception for new people coming. Well, I arrived a week before school started, but 3 other teachers arrived the very night of the receptions. 2 from Ohio and 1 from Nova Scotia. And the one from Nova Scotia, by the way, one of the questions asked on the application to teach at this school, and I had not initiated the application, this was all done by other people, was, "Are you contemplating marriage?" And I said no, and that's the answer they really wanted. But when I saw that girl from Nova Scotia walk in, somehow it struck me as a very important moment. And as the weeks and months and years progressed, a relationship developed that after, well, we still had a year together, but about midway between a 3-year period, we announced our engagement. But so that was probably, apart from the marriage then, a very high moment. In one word, it would be very positive. And I think that's been sort of the um, attitude through most of my life's experiences. I was not a negative person. I was not a person that complained and thought that somebody ought to do more for me, or etc. And of course, tied to that very attitude was the attitude of gratitude, being grateful for whatever. So both of those qualities, I think, stood me in good stead throughout my life's journey. If you are a complaining person and never feel that everything is done right for you, then you don't tend to be grateful. But I suppose the two go sort of hand in hand. The purpose of my life has centered, of course, in my profession. And my profession has a very deep relationship to God and my faith. And because of that, so many experiences have come to me which, from just a human point of view, here's this little boy growing up in a good home where I spoke German before I spoke English, went to country school, and to think of that boy growing up. And during the Depression, when my father and the family had left the farm and moved into town, and my brother, who was the oldest, got married and bought the farm, so that my father no longer, well, for a few, maybe a year and a half, he worked for the Kiel Woodenware. I worked for that same manufacturing business in Kiel for 2 summers. But it was during the early 30s, Depression, and so that though we were never poor, my father was a progressive farmer. We had Model T Fords. My father bought a car for my brother because, after all, he was working on the farm, and then bought the farm. So we weren't wealthy, but we never lacked the basic necessities of life. But when it came to my wanting to go to college, having moved to town, my father no longer, well, for a year had income, but then was dependent upon my brother paying the family for buying the farm. They had to be rather careful, well, paying for the house that was bought. To be able to go to college was a sort of almost a miracle for me, financially. So the first year I went to what is now called, well, it was then called the Mission House. The United Church of Christ had a seminary at a community about 10 miles from Kiel. The seminary also had a college with it. And for a year I attended that college, my freshman year, because I could drive back and forth, and there were others from the community, so we could change cars and save money that way and spread it around. It made it possible. But then going to Taylor University in Indiana, it was my sister who had graduated from high school, was a stenographer, and was in the office of this same manufacturing company in Kiel, who was able to help in paying my tuition and room and board, although I worked in college likewise. Well, I suppose my philosophical questions are also very closely tied up with my faith. And, you know, faith is like a two-sided coin. It has the faith side, it also has the doubt side. And I don't think there are any people who really have a strong faith who also don't have doubts. And there have been a struggle, especially when I was active in my ministry. I've never accepted the idea that the Bible is absolute in terms of every word being true, and that was being dictated by God. After all, I believe that the writers were inspired, but they were still human. And after all, when you think of the Bible, how it was written, it's really a miracle to think that here you have 66 books, 39 in the Old Testament and 27 in the New, all being put together in one book that was decided by men in the 3rd century. So it's amazing, but there are contradictions in the Bible, and it seems to me contradictions really provide a foundation for truth, because no person, if suddenly something happened and then you reported on it and you reported on it and I reported on it, the reports would all be different. The same experience, but you saw it differently than I did or you did. So that it seems to me the fact that there are contradictions of events tends to support the idea that it is true as far as the individual writers are concerned, though they may differ. Yes, and especially more since I've retired and since I'm older than I thought I would be. And it has to do with heaven. And when you study the New Testament, there are contradictions as to what happens when you die. There's the emphasis on the general resurrection. Well, that assumes that everybody that dies is in sort of no man's land, or the spirit is dead. You just wait for the general resurrection. Now, Jesus, and there are other portions in the New Testament, would simply indicate and talk about heaven as those who have committed their lives to Jesus Christ. Heaven is immediate upon death. That is the spirit. We talk about the soul. Well, the soul is hard to define, and you can't identify it in terms of any, like your lungs or your brain. But it's related to your emotional and mind, of course. It's that aspect, from my point of view, of life that remains when the body dies. The soul lives on. And when Jesus said to the one thief hanging on the cross, who was criticizing the other thief who was criticizing Jesus, and then he said, no, we are talking to the two criminals here justly. We have done wrong, but then Jesus has not. And then Jesus said, well, this day thou shalt be with me in paradise. In other words, upon death will be your soul will be together. So, and there are other portions, likewise, in the scriptures, which indicate. But heaven is a very, nobody's ever reported, although people report on out-of-life experiences. More recently, a woman who was in a kayak, or going down a difficult stream, and was caught and was underwater, and had this, describes this, and now I understand has written a book. I have not seen the book, but has this. I've read the article, a very vivid description of her experience of this out-of-life experience. So, how did I get onto this subject?
Unresolved questions? Or is it still unresolved?
But as I wrestle with this idea that, and I accept and have in my preaching and in my conducting of funerals, always stressed the aspect of life immediate after death. So, but that's been sort of a unresolved struggle. It's just something that I hope to have an answer to someday. Well, beauty is an aspect of, it's a spiritual quality. Beauty, it's not something you can touch, but it's there. It's there in people, it's there in the creation, and so I see heaven as a beautiful place. And there is a passage in Scripture that says, eye has not seen, nor ear heard, the wonderful things that God has prepared for those who love him. Well, the wonderful things would have to be beautiful. And I think heaven is a place where love is just permeates the atmosphere. People, there is a story about heaven and hell, and all the people in heaven and hell had something attached to their arms with like a spoon. And in hell, they were starving. In heaven, see, they couldn't feed themselves. They were feeding each other and living. That's sort of the story sort of illustrates that in heaven there's a caring, loving spirit. Whatever sense, and of course the body, and Jesus talked about that we will have a new body. And so just what that body will be like, but there's indication, certainly in the scriptures, that the soul in a new body, the souls can identify each other. It would be hell not to. Yeah. Electa loved the hymn, morning comes early. Da 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 da. I don't know it well, as well. This is a hymn about crossing the Jordan. One by one they cross the portals, there to dwell with the immortals. When they ring those golden bells for you and me, don't you hear the angels singing? 'Tis those golden bells for you and me.
That was beautiful.
You know, every cruel act against another human being may result in one of the most heroic and sacrificial acts on the part of someone else to do something about that situation, risking their own lives. And in a sense, I feel for, of course, people, you know, in the armed services have made their commitment, and they will risk their lives to help a comrade under the situation. But there is, and that concerns me a lot, there is a lot of cruelty to children. And that's so hard to deal with because they can't do anything about it, you know, in the home. Even they are, physically put in pain because of abuse. But on the other hand, the majority, of course, parents are loving and do everything they can. So you have to think in terms that I don't know what the percentage of abuse is nationally on the part of parents or acquaintances on children. And whatever it is, it's too high. But that's a major concern of mine. This is not a perfect universe. And even in the scriptures talk about creation yearning for the day when there will be a new earth and a new world. Well, this idea that the creation is not perfect, even though God, the Genesis talks about being good. It is good, but earthquakes, tornadoes, whatever, kill or injure a lot of people. So we live in that, we live in a world in which there are contradictions. And we have to recognize that and cope with it the best we can. Well, it's amazing the number of individuals that form groups and join groups that are dedicated to making the world a better place in which to live. And well, let's say the Red Cross, for example. Of course, it's meeting tragedy, but it's also a way of saying we want the world to be better. Politically, there are things too that can be done, and often are done, but too often political decisions are too partisan, and what may better one segment may not better the other segment. But I think private groups, for the most part, and in that regard, I would say the church, in spite of all of the criticisms and failures of the church, and the church is not a perfect instrument, but I don't know of any other organization in the world that has done as much to try to make this a better world than the church. Well, I think the most important thing, of course, was the support of family, and that was true from both sides of the family. But in my personal life, to deal with it, the fact that I could sit down at the piano and play hymns without looking at the notes. And I would play hymns that were very meaningful to me. And maybe I'd sing the words while tears would roll down my cheeks. But it became a place where I felt being healed of the sorrow. It didn't take the sorrow away, but it made it lighter. And then, of course, over years, you never forget, but you do develop the resources, and so many other things shape your life that you move beyond the tragedy to feel life is good. never seen that music, but just hearing it, and when I think of Helen, or when I play this, I play it for her. Well, I think it's the internet, the communications, of the whole area of communications is just profound. Cell phones throughout the world now, everybody has cell phones, and you know, that's like the internet. But and I of course don't know much about internet or Facebook, but I do get from television that anything on Facebook, just goes mile. Oh, it's just known all over the world. So I haven't listed positives and negatives. I'm more inclined to think positively. It's good to have communications, but as a result, people aren't writing wonderful letters as much. So there's that. When you think of historically letters that have been preserved, well, and I have a pack of letters, not all of them, but so written between my mother and father before they were married. Basically, the system under which we live in the U.S. has had a similar thread throughout my life. Emphasis on freedom, and I think really concern for each other as part of our culture. That has really been the same. I've always, and I mentioned this in my book too, felt that as a youngster, going to a country school with a teacher who was with us for 5 years, he came when he was 19, left when he was 24. And those were my formative years that I lacked a good 8th grade education. And I don't remember reading a book. I remember a Billy Gruff, that's a Billy Goat Gruff book from my youth. We had no major books in our home. Reading wasn't stressed. We had a church paper, both German and English. But in that regard, you see, others of my age had more of an advantage in an early education than I did. But somehow I picked it up and got by. I can hear the angels calling, I can hear. That's a hymn. So on. I think of when President Kennedy was shot. That was a major, because I I had lots of hope for our nation under his, and I was a pastor at Appleton at the time. I think he was shot on a Friday. I knew I couldn't preach the sermon I had prepared on Sunday. I had to deal with that. But apart from that, that was really minor compared to the feeling that, and now historically now, who was shot first? Was Kennedy or King? The fact that we'd have assassinations like that, and then of course Kennedy's brother, right? It was a something that I thought was unbelievable in the United States. They may be doing it elsewhere in other countries, shooting their political leaders, but that doesn't happen here. Well, it had happened, of course, to a few presidents. Lincoln, naturally. Those were very troublesome and sad times that were jarring. Family and friends make a lot of birthday celebrations when you're 100 or 101. This picture on the table there that Sue arranged and took some pictures for my 101th birthday and had a cake with 101 candles. By the time they got all of them lit, it was time to blow them out. Blow some of them out. Well, I do think that your lifestyle is a factor. Your diet, moderation. If I were 250, 300 pounds, I probably wouldn't be here. So I decided about 2 years ago when I was 180 that was too heavy. And then being pretty sedentary in retirement, so then I just cut back and didn't suffer it in the process. Over a year, lost 30 pounds. I'm not averse to the idea, and I always would encourage explorations to find out. You know, if there isn't, you wonder about the extravagance of creation, to have all of this huge, vast universe, which is still expanding rapidly, growing bigger. It's hard to imagine. It's because it's space and stars and planets and here's this little Earth ship. It's really think of it as a ship that you're on. It's floating around here, but it's an infinitesimal little ball compared to the vastness of the universe. So it doesn't jar my faith to think that there'd be life anywhere else. That'll be, I think, wonderful. I don't believe in ghosts, no. Well, I think it's important, of course, to remain mentally active. But I also know that the physical aspect of memory, we know about Alzheimer's, but also just loss of memory is something that the person who's losing it can't do much about. It's an internal brain function, something is, and they're always, brain studies are always seeing what produces aging and what absentia and so on. So that although I try to remain, and I have been, that's why I want to, though I can't read books anymore, I want to listen to good books. And I do a pretty good job of keeping in touch with the news. I read the newspaper, in a very minimal way. The headlines, paragraph or two, maybe the paragraph end of the article. So I sort of know what's going on. I want to know what's going on in our world. And of course, television. I wear blue quite a bit. Now, this shirt is not blue, but my friends here, and of course they're all women. I have men friends too, but they don't bother what color I wear. Well, blue looks good on you, Marvin. And I wear blue some, but I think and so it is a favorable color, but I think brown, though it may not look as good on me, brown is a favorite color of mine, and shades of brown. Green is not a favorite color. But blue is a good color. So I think it would be between blue and brown as to the favorite. Not a cat. I'm allergic to cats. I'd like to be a gold retriever. Food? Well, if you put their categories, desserts are pretty high on the list.
Which kind of dessert would be?
Well, I love all kinds of pie, but I guess maybe my favorite pie is pecan pie. But cherry would be next.
That sounds pretty good.
And I'm not very high on exotic kinds of foods. I like mashed potatoes and meat, chicken or beef, vegetables. I don't have any, I'm not high on liver, for instance. I don't care for liver. I like onions, but unless liver is fried and well done, if it's still soft, that turns me off. But I like every kind of, I like, now there are some people who don't like soup of any kind. They don't eat soup. I enjoy soup, and I feel sometimes rather than have it made, I just open a can of soup with crackers, and then Elaine Gall, it's probably a month ago now, and I brought me a pecan pie. I still have, I think, 4 pieces in the freezer, but occasionally I indulge in a pecan pie piece and put it in the microwave, and then put some yogurt ice cream on top for dessert.
Sounds pretty good to me.
But I can't, growing up in the farm, I remember we had fried potatoes. And any fried potato that was burned, I would just gag me. It still does. I can't eat that type of, now, so when I occasionally for breakfast, they may serve hash browns. Now, hash browns are fine, but not American fries. What I used to do as a youngster is put those under the plate. Of course, it wasn't hiding anything to people that served them. Knew my problem. Billy Graham was the evangelist I wanted to. When I mentioned it, you know.
Oh yeah.
And this was his call, you know, when he invited people to come forward. And then, of course. That's.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much, Grandpa.
When I was in Milwaukee, as chaplain of our homes, and they actually were in West Allis, I was asked to speak to some of the nurses. And I developed a lecture on a question. And the question was Robert Browning right? And I quote from Robert Browning's poem, "Grow old along with me. The best is yet to be. The last of life for which the first was made. Youth shows but half. Trust God, be unafraid." So, was Browning right? Grow old along with me, the best is yet to be? My answer 40 years ago was yes. He was right. My answer today is still yes. Now it's not, I know, it's not yes for everybody, I'm sure, who feel that the latter part of life is unbearable. And if they're lying in a nursing home and are in pain and are having all kinds of physical problems, I don't think they would say that Browning was right. But that was a quote. The other quote about life and the future that I use is from Stevenson, Robert Louis Stevenson. "I know not what the future holds of marvel or surprise. I only know that life and death God's mercy underlies. I know not where the islands lift their fronded palms in air. I only know I cannot drift beyond God's love and care. That's a quote that I say to myself, it means a lot to me. Robert Louis Stevenson was, of course, a poet. Then there's a quote from the poem Thanatopsis. Do you know that poem? Mm-hmm. Go not, that's Thanatopsis, and I'm not sure about the author now. I wish of course, if I could use the computer, which I'm free to, but I no longer can do it because I don't see well enough. But the latter part of that poem, what it talks about the end of life, go not as a quarry slave scourged to his dungeon, but go serene and smooth as one who wraps the drapery from his couch about him and lies down to pleasant dreams. That's a quote concerning the end of life. I used to, for the kids, years ago, and they still remember, when I made up a story about George and Martha Washington, and they'd go out for a walk, and the beauty, and then they'd see the waterfall. I don't know that I can still, I never saw the music, but this is the waterfall. They'd come and say, "Daddy, play that George Washington song."
That's so sweet. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, or anything else you want us to know about?
No, but I understand you have the wedding date set.
Yes, June 1st next year.
June 1st?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
That will be our 7-year anniversary.
Mm.
Yeah.
So then we don't have to learn a new anniversary. I can just have that one date to remember.
Yeah, well, you just be sure you never forget that anniversary.